On September 1st, 1939, German armored columns crossed into Poland and the familiar story of the Second World War began. Hitler demanded the territory diplomacy failed, and aggression finally met resistance. All of that is true, but the tanks were not the beginning of the system that sent them forward. They were the visible edge of an economy rebuilt around rearmament, a dictatorship committed to racial empire, and a European order weakened by debt depression and collapsing cooperation. The invasion was the trigger. The deeper question is why conquest had come to appear inside Berlin and later Tokyo not merely desirable but increasingly necessary to sustain the military machines their governments had created. To understand that machinery, we have to return to the peace after the First World War. The Treaty of Versailles reduced German territory, restricted its armed forces, and imposed responsibility for reparations. France and Britain, meanwhile, carried enormous war debts owed largely to the United States. The result was not a single chain of command, but a fragile circuit of payments. American money flowed into Germany through loans. German payments moved toward France and Britain. Part of that money then crossed the Atlantic again to service Allied debts. The Dawes Plan of 1924 made the system more manageable, but it did not remove its dependence on continued confidence and American lending. Europe had designed a peace that relied on money circulating through countries that distrusted one another. For several years, the circuit appeared to work. German cities modernized factories, borrowed governments, stabilized their currencies, and investors treated the continent as if the worst disorder had passed. Yet the stability rested on capital and political bargains that could be reversed. When the American financial crisis spread across the Atlantic after 1929, loans contracted, banks came under pressure, trade collapsed, and governments defended their own currencies and industries at the expense of their neighbors. Tariffs and exchange controls divided the world into competing economic zones. A system that required Germany to earn foreign currency became less willing to buy German exports. The Depression did not mechanically create fascism. It destroyed alternatives, radicalized electorates, and gave authoritarian movements the opportunity to present coercion as competence. In Germany, that promise was brutally effective. The Nazis offered work-restored national power and freedom from the humiliations of Versailles. They also destroyed unions, eliminated political opposition, excluded Jews from public life, and built policy around a racial vision of conquest in Eastern Europe. Economic recovery and ideological preparation advanced together. Factories reopened, but an increasing share of their orders came from the state. Steel became artillery. Aluminum became aircraft. Chemical research was redirected toward explosives fuel and synthetic materials. The regime did not simply repair a civilian economy and later choose war. It reorganized production so that recovery itself became tied to military expansion. A worker could see wages returning and machines running again, while the destination of that production was hidden in contracts ministries and classified procurement schedules. The financial mechanism behind this transformation was less dramatic than a rally, but just as important. Hjalmar Schacht, president of the Reichsbank and later economics minister, helped create a system in which armaments firms received bills issued through a shell company known as MIFO. Suppliers could hold the bills, pass them to banks, or ultimately rediscount them through the Reichsbank. The arrangement postponed payment, concealed part of rearmament from ordinary budget scrutiny, and allowed the state to place military orders before collecting the taxes required to pay for them. It was not free money. It was a promise that future German production revenue or expansion would make the obligations good. Finance did not invent Hitler's ambitions. It allowed those ambitions to become aircraft guns, vehicles, and factories before the full bill arrived. The scale of the shift reveals what the propaganda concealed. A reconstruction of the German economy places the military budget at roughly 11% of gross domestic product in 1936. By 1938, military spending was consuming about 17% of national income, even though Germany was still formally at peace. This was not ordinary recovery spending. It was an economy choosing weapons over other uses of labor, steel machinery, and foreign exchange. The famous Autobahns mattered symbolically and strategically, but the decisive expansion of public demand came from rearmament. The results were impressive. Unemployment fell, industrial output rose, and the regime displayed modern factories as evidence that dictatorship had solved problems democracy could not. But the achievement contained a deadline. The faster Germany armed, the faster it consumed the materials required to continue arming. That deadline appeared in the foreign exchange accounts. Germany possessed coal and a formidable industrial base, but it lacked secure domestic supplies of several resources needed for modern war. Oil, rubber, high-grade ores, and some foodstuffs had to be imported. Imports required foreign currency earned through exports or obtained through tightly managed trade agreements. Rearmament made the problem worse. Military factories drew workers and materials away from export industries. While controls and bilateral deals limited flexibility, Germany could build more aircraft, but aircraft demanded fuel. It could expand motorized forces, but mobility deepened dependence on petroleum. It could create employment, but suppressing consumer imports and civilian consumption became necessary to preserve scarce exchange for weapons and raw materials. The economic miracle was real for many Germans, but it was not balanced, liberal, or self-sustaining. Schacht's new plan responded by rationing foreign currency and steering trade toward bilateral agreements, especially with countries in southeastern Europe. Germany would buy agricultural goods and raw materials, often through clearing arrangements that kept payments inside a controlled Reichsmark system, while those countries bought German manufactured goods. This reduced the immediate need for sterling or dollars and increased German influence over smaller economies. Yet, it did not solve the central problem. Germany was preparing for war against powers with wider access to global resources, while avoiding dependence on the world market those powers helped dominate. Trade policy could rearrange scarcity. It could not abolish it. The more the regime feared blockade and encirclement, the more attractive territorial control became. In 1936, Hitler placed Hermann Göring in charge of the four-year plan, ordering the economy to become ready for war within 4 years. Synthetic fuel from coal synthetic rubber, expanded steel production import substitution, and tighter direction of investment were intended to make Germany less vulnerable. Industrial firms gained contract subsidies and protected markets, but they also operated inside a system in which the state increasingly determined priorities. The plan revealed both the power and weakness of Nazi economic rule. A dictatorship could command resources quickly. It could delay consumption, override objections, and compel companies to pursue costly strategic projects. But it could not efficiently manufacture every missing resource. Synthetic substitutes demanded capital, energy, and time. Autarky was not independence. It was an expensive attempt to survive long enough to seize a larger economic base. This is where historians divide emphasis. Adam Tooze has argued that Nazi leaders understood Germany's vulnerability in a world where the United States possessed industrial resources on a scale Europe could not easily match. From that perspective, the Eastern Empire Hitler imagined was not merely a traditional land grab. It was an attempt to acquire the territory, food labor, and raw materials needed for a racial superstate capable of competing in a continental age. Richard Overy and other historians add an essential qualification: resource pressure, narrowed choices, but ideology determined which choices the regime considered legitimate. Germany could have reduced armament, restored trade, or accepted limits. Hitler rejected those paths because conquest and racial domination were not emergency measures attached to Nazism. They were central to it. Economics shaped the method and timing. It did not excuse the purpose. The human cost was visible before the shooting began. Recovery statistics concealed a society being sorted by race politics and usefulness to the state. Independent unions disappeared. Wages and consumption were restrained while armaments firms expanded. Jewish professionals and business owners were excluded, dispossessed, and pushed outside economic life through escalating persecution. Young men entered military service, and families were encouraged to interpret sacrifice as national renewal. A father who had feared unemployment could now bring home a wage from a factory producing engines or shells, but his security depended on a state that required permanent mobilization. The regime had converted employment into loyalty and scarcity into discipline. It had also created institutions whose budgets, careers, and prestige depended on continued rearmament. Across Eurasia, Japan was building a different version of the same trap. Japan had become a major industrial and naval power, but the home islands lacked abundant domestic supplies of petroleum, rubber, bauxite, and other strategic materials. Its factories and fleet depended on maritime trade. The seizure of Manchuria in 1931 offered coal land, railways, and industrial possibilities, and Japanese planners described the territory as part of a more secure regional order. In practice, expansion produced resistance, administrative costs, and deeper military commitments. The wider war in China after 1937 consumed weapons fuel shipping and public revenue. Japan sought security through empire, but every new campaign increased the volume of resources required to defend that empire. The map of Japan's supply lines exposed the danger. Much of the oil and industrial material needed by the Japanese military came from outside the empire, with the United States serving as the principal supplier of petroleum and several other commodities. Southeast Asia held oil, rubber, and tin, but many of those resources lay inside European colonial systems, protected by British, Dutch, and French power. Japanese leaders therefore faced a contradiction of their own making. Continued war in China intensified dependence on imports from countries increasingly opposed to that war. Withdrawal would preserve access to trade, but threaten the prestige and authority of the military. Further expansion promised resources but risked conflict with powers whose combined industrial strength exceeded Japan's. What looked like encirclement from Tokyo was also the consequence of decisions made in Tokyo. For Chinese civilians, these calculations were not abstractions on a ministry wall. Railways became military corridors, ports became supply bases, food and transport were requisitioned, towns were bombed, communities displaced, and families pushed into flight as occupation expanded. The search for an economically self-sufficient empire was imposed through force on people who had no voice in its design. That reality matters because the language of scarcity can make aggression sound automatic. It was not. German and Japanese leaders confronted genuine material constraints, but they chose to answer them through domination. Their economic problems did not compel invasion. Their political systems made invasion an acceptable solution. By the end of the 1930s, Germany and Japan had created military machines that appeared stronger than the economies beneath them. Both regimes had restored confidence through production-disciplined society, through control, and treated access to resources as a measure of national survival. Yet neither had achieved the self-sufficiency it promised. Germany needed imported oil ores and food while preparing to challenge the powers that controlled the sea. Japan needed foreign petroleum while fighting a war that made its suppliers increasingly hostile. The contradiction could be postponed through bills clearing agreements, synthetic substitutes, rationing, and propaganda. It could not be postponed forever. In September 1939, the German deadline arrived first. The tanks entered Poland, and an economic system built to prepare for a short victorious war was about to discover the cost of a long one. Blitzkrieg was not merely a battlefield doctrine, it was an economic gamble. Germany's leaders understood that a prolonged war against several industrial powers would expose the shortages beneath their rearmament program. Their answer was speed, concentrate armor, and aircraft break enemy armies before they could fully mobilize and seize the territory needed to sustain the next campaign. Poland fell quickly. Denmark and Norway followed. In May 1940, German forces struck through the Low Countries and shattered France in 6 weeks. The victories seemed to prove that organization and audacity could overcome deeper material weakness. But every advance extended supply lines, consumed fuel-damaged infrastructure, and created new populations to control. Germany was winning territory faster than it was building a durable system to govern and supply it. Conquest initially offered an extraordinary economic prize. German authorities gained access to factories, mines, harvests, railway networks, foreign exchange reserves, and millions of workers. Occupied governments were required to cover the costs of German forces stationed on their soil. Goods were purchased through clearing systems and exchange rates designed to favor the right. Machinery, food vehicles, and raw materials moved toward Germany often, without equivalent value moving back. The official language described a reorganized European economy. The practical reality was extraction, yet exploitation created a feedback loop. The more Germany depended on occupied resources, the more troops, administrators, police, and transport capacity it needed to maintain control. Conquest was supposed to solve scarcity. Instead, scarcity made further conquest appear necessary. Terror made that economy more coercive, but not necessarily more efficient. As German men entered the armed forces, the regime increasingly deported civilians from occupied Europe and compelled prisoners to work in German farms, mines, construction projects, and factories. Millions labored under threat, separated from their families, and frequently denied adequate food, housing, medical care, or protection. Jewish forced labor operated within a broader system of persecution that moved towards systematic mass murder. Nazi racial ideology repeatedly overruled economic logic, destroying skilled workers and entire communities, even while German industry complained of labor shortages. By the final years of the war, major companies were seeking prisoners from an expanding camp system. The regime had built an industrial order in which human beings could be allocated like raw material and discarded when exhaustion made them less useful. Across the Channel, Britain faced a different kind of limit. The Royal Navy still guarded a global network, and the British Empire could draw on food soldiers, commodities, and bases across several continents. But Britain could not pay indefinitely for the weapons, aircraft, fuel, and food it needed from the Western Hemisphere. After the fall of France, survival depended increasingly on dollars and American production. Britain sold overseas assets, tightened exchange controls, drew on gold and foreign reserves, and purchased supplies under cash-and-carry rules. These measures bought time, but the financial margin was shrinking. The British state could mobilize people and command domestic resources. It could not create American dollars by decree. If the flow of overseas supplies stopped, military courage alone could not keep ships fueled or aircraft factories operating. Lend-Lease changed the calculation. Enacted in March 1941, it allowed the United States to transfer weapons and other strategically important goods without demanding immediate cash payment for every shipment. The legal language presented the equipment as material lent or leased for the defense of the United States. In practice, it recognized that requiring Britain to exhaust its remaining dollars before receiving help would weaken the country standing between Germany and the Atlantic. Credit had become a weapon. An aircraft delivered to Britain was not simply an export. It was American industrial capacity placed inside another country's war effort. Lend-Lease did not remove cost, and it did not eliminate disputes over priorities. It changed when payment was required and allowed strategy rather than Britain's remaining cash balance to guide the movement of supplies. Those supplies still had to cross an ocean. The Atlantic became a battlefield, measured in cargo space, tanker capacity, escort vessels, port, congestion, insurance repair time, and tons of shipping lost. A tank sitting in an American warehouse had no military value to Britain. It had to reach a port, be loaded onto a merchant ship, survive German submarines, be unloaded, transported inland, maintained, fueled, and assigned to a trained crew. German U-boats tried to sever this chain faster than Allied shipyards could replace it. The convoy system, air patrols, intelligence, escort carriers, and mass production of merchant vessels gradually shifted the balance. The Allies did not defeat scarcity. They created a logistical system capable of absorbing losses without allowing the flow to collapse. Germany expected to escape that long struggle by turning east. Operation Barbarossa, launched against the Soviet Union in June 1941, was both an ideological war of annihilation and a bid for territory, grain, labor, minerals, and eventually access to oil. German planners expected the Soviet state to disintegrate after a series of rapid defeats. Instead, Soviet authorities dismantled industrial equipment, loaded machinery onto railway cars, and moved factories and workers eastward beyond the immediate reach of the invasion. Production resumed under brutal conditions. Workers endured cold, hunger, overcrowding, punishing hours, and the loss of homes and relatives. Central planning could concentrate resources with extraordinary force, but it did so by placing military survival above almost every civilian need. Germany captured enormous territory. It failed to destroy the Soviet capacity to regenerate armies. The same year, Japan's resource dilemma became acute. The war in China continued to consume money, ships, fuel, and material, while Japanese expansion into French Indochina intensified American opposition. Washington froze Japanese assets, and petroleum exports became subject to a licensing system that effectively cut Japan off from its principal foreign oil supplier. American officials understood that severe economic pressure could push Japan toward military action in Southeast Asia. Japanese leaders understood that existing oil reserves would not support indefinite war. Yet the crisis was not imposed on a peaceful state without choices. Japan could have reduced its commitments in China or accepted limits on further expansion. Its military and political leadership regarded retreat as a threat to imperial prestige, domestic authority, and the future of the empire. The attack on Pearl Harbor was therefore connected to a much larger operation. Japan intended to seize the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies and the rubber tin ports and strategic positions of Southeast Asia. The United States Pacific Fleet and American bases in the Philippines could interfere with that movement. The strike against Hawaii was designed to buy time by disabling the force most capable of challenging Japan's advance. It was an attempt to protect a resource war by winning a naval war at the beginning. The decision solved no permanent economic problem. Oil fields had to be captured intact, repaired, refined, loaded into tankers, escorted across thousands of miles, and delivered through waters increasingly exposed to submarines. Japan had seized a resource zone. It had also begun a production contest with the largest industrial economy on Earth. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States possessed immense productive potential, but only part of it had been organized for global war. After December 1941, federal contracts allocation boards plant construction and guaranteed purchasing transformed civilian industry. Automobile factories produced engines, trucks, aircraft components, and armored vehicles. Shipyards expanded along both coasts and far inland. Chemical firms supplied explosives, synthetic rubber aviation fuel, and pharmaceuticals. Between July 1940 and August 1945, American factories produced approximately 300,000 aircraft. Shipyards delivered thousands of military and merchant vessels, including more than 2,700 mass-produced Liberty ships. The power was not simply the quantity made once. It was the ability to replace destroyed equipment while supplying several theaters and multiple allies at the same time. Production on that scale required a financial system as organized as the factories. The federal government raised taxes, sold bonds borrowed from financial institutions, and encouraged households to transfer current purchasing power into war savings. The Federal Reserve supported Treasury financing by holding interest rates at low levels, including a fixed rate on short-term Treasury bills and a ceiling on long-term government bond yields. Cheap borrowing helped prevent the rising demand for funds from driving the cost of the war sharply upward. But finance could create demand faster than factories could create civilian goods. Millions of workers were earning wages while steel, rubber, fuel, and machinery were being directed toward military use. Price controls and rationing attempted to prevent that imbalance from becoming uncontrolled inflation. A ration coupon became a second currency, determining whether money could legally buy gasoline, sugar, meat, or tires. The American mobilization opened jobs and raised incomes, but its benefits were distributed unevenly. Women entered shipyards, aircraft plants, offices, and laboratories in enormous numbers, often performing skilled work while receiving less pay and less security than men. Black Americans moved toward industrial centers and pressed employers and the federal government to confront discrimination even as segregation remained embedded in the armed forces and civilian life. Mexican-American workers and migrants filled critical positions while facing unequal treatment. Japanese Americans on the West Coast were forcibly removed and incarcerated by their own government, losing homes, farms, businesses, and freedom under a policy justified as military necessity. The Allied war economy could mobilize resources more effectively than the Axis system without becoming free of racism, coercion, or injustice. Lend-Lease turned the American factory system into the supply base of a coalition. Britain received aircraft ships, food vehicles, industrial equipment, and raw materials. The Soviet Union received not only weapons but trucks, locomotives, railway cars, communications equipment, metals, food, and other supplies that became especially valuable as Soviet armies moved westward. The importance of this aid cannot be measured only by comparing it with total Soviet output. A truck could release horses for other work, move artillery more quickly, and carry supplies farther from a railhead. A locomotive could connect distant production to a moving front. The Soviet Union provided the armies and paid the overwhelming human cost of fighting Germany on land. Lend-Lease strengthened the mobility and endurance of that effort. This is why simple comparisons of national income do not fully explain victory. Economic size established possibilities, not outcomes. Richard Overy and Mark Harrison have emphasized the importance of mobilization. Governments had to determine how much civilian consumption could be sacrificed, which weapons should receive priority, and how labor and capital could be shifted without causing the system to fail. Phillips, Pace, and O'Brien has pushed the argument toward air and sea power. showing how enormous resources were consumed in the struggle to destroy aircraft ships, fuel supplies, and transport networks. Historians disagree over the relative importance of land battles, strategic bombing, naval warfare, and aggregate production. But they converge on one point. Resources mattered only when institutions converted them into usable force. By 1944, the Axis and Allied economic models had become unmistakably different. Germany and Japan had tried to create self-sufficient empires through conquest. Their systems depended on coercion, vulnerable transport networks, and the rapid exploitation of occupied territory. The Allies constructed an imperfect but larger network based on shared production shipping, financial support, imperial resources, and strategic allocation. That network contained profound tensions. Britain defended imperial interests. The Soviet Union demanded a second front. American commanders competed over ships and material. Colonial populations supplied labor and commodities without equal political rights. Yet the coalition could shift resources among theaters without requiring every member to produce everything it needed. Its interdependence became a strength rather than a sign of vulnerability. The result was a widening gap that no single battlefield victory could reverse. Germany lost access to fuel, while Allied bombers and advancing armies attacked refineries, synthetic plants, railways, and bridges. Japan's merchant fleet was destroyed faster than it could be replaced, leaving oil and other resources stranded far from the factories and bases that required them. Aircraft remained on the ground for lack of fuel. Vehicles waited for spare parts. Skilled pilots and crews died faster than training systems could replace them. The Axis powers had begun the war hoping that rapid conquest would compensate for economic weakness. A long war exposed every weakness at once, and while the armies closed in, another struggle was already beginning in conference rooms and treasury offices. The struggle to decide which country, which currency, and which institutions would organize the peace. By 1944, the decisive battlefield was often a railway junction, an oil refinery, or a merchant ship disappearing beneath the sea. Germany still possessed armies, factories, and technically sophisticated weapons. Japan still controlled a vast perimeter across Asia and the Pacific. But both powers were losing the ability to connect production with combat. German aircraft waited for fuel. Locomotives struggled through bombed rail networks. Japanese tankers vanished under submarine attack, leaving oil stranded thousands of miles from the fleet that needed it. Economic collapse did not replace military defeat. It made military defeat increasingly irreversible. Once a state could no longer move supplies, train replacements, repair equipment, or protect its transport system, courage at the front could only delay the end. Allied attacks on fuel and transportation gradually turned Axis geography against itself. Germany had conquered much of Europe, but conquest had created an enormous network of roads, railways, depots, pipelines, factories, and occupied territories that had to function together. Bombing did not immediately erase German industrial output. In several sectors, production continued rising even as cities were destroyed. The deeper damage came when finished weapons could no longer reach the battlefield, when coal could not reach power stations, and when synthetic fuel plants could not replace what aircraft and armored forces consumed. Japan faced an even harsher version of the same problem. Its empire depended on sea lanes stretching from Southeast Asian oil fields to refinery shipyards and military bases. Once American submarines and aircraft broke those routes, territorial possession ceased to guarantee usable supply. Behind this material collapse stood an economy built on organized plunder. Occupied governments had been forced to finance German troops. Farms surrendered food. Factories delivered machinery and weapons. Workers were deported across borders. Millions of prisoners, civilians, and concentration camp inmates were compelled to labor under conditions designed around exhaustion rather than survival. This system filled shortages, but it also exposed the moral nature of the regime that created it. Nazi Germany did not merely mobilize resources harshly, it defined entire populations as expendable. Economic exploitation and racial persecution reinforced one another even when extermination destroyed labor that German industry claimed to need. The apparent contradiction disappears once ideology is taken seriously. The purpose of the Nazi state was not efficient production alone. It was conquest, racial domination, and the destruction of those it declared unworthy of existence. The Holocaust cannot be reduced to a search for property labor or financial gain. Its central force was an exterminatory racial ideology implemented through state institutions, police-powered deportation systems, and industrialized murder. Yet economics formed part of the machinery of persecution. Jewish homes, businesses, savings, and possessions were confiscated. Deportees were robbed before transport. Those temporarily selected for labor were worked under lethal conditions. Their property entered government accounts, private hands, municipal warehouses, and corporate supply chains. The result was not a rational economic program. It was genocide accompanied by plunder. Any explanation of the war that follows money must stop at this distinction. Material benefit can help explain participation and institutional cooperation. It cannot explain away ideological intent, and it cannot transform mass murder into an unintended consequence of economic policy. The price extended far beyond Germany's victims, although responsibility was not equally distributed. Across the Soviet Union, burned villages, ruined factories, destroyed farms, and mass graves marked the path of occupation and retreat. In China, years of invasion had shattered transport systems, displaced families, and deepened hunger. Japanese cities were devastated by incendiary bombing, while atomic weapons destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki and killed civilians on a scale that still shapes historical debate. European ports, bridges, homes, and industrial districts lay in ruins. Returning soldiers discovered that victory did not restore the people, neighborhoods, or livelihoods that had disappeared. National accounts could estimate lost output and destroyed capital. They could not measure the value of a missing generation, a family photograph buried beneath rubble, or the years spent searching for relatives who would never return. Victory also revealed how differently the major Allied powers had paid. The Soviet Union emerged with a vast army and decisive influence in Eastern Europe, but it had suffered extraordinary human and physical destruction. Britain remained a global power, yet the war had drained its reserves, increased its overseas liabilities, and made continued dependence on American finance impossible to ignore. The United States had sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives, mobilized millions of service members, and imposed rationing and controls at home. But its cities and industrial base had not been devastated. Its factories had expanded. Its financial markets were intact. Its government had become the central supplier of the winning coalition. The war had weakened nearly every traditional center of industrial power while strengthening the country already capable of producing on a continental scale. This is why the claim that the war ended the Great Depression requires care. American unemployment collapsed, factories operated at extraordinary intensity, and national output rose dramatically. For millions of workers, wartime employment brought wages, skills, and opportunities that had been absent during the 1930s. But a society can produce more without allowing civilians to consume more. Tanks, bombs, and warships entered national accounts even though they did not improve household living standards. Civilian goods were restricted. Families faced rationing, crowded housing, and separation. Millions of men served under military compulsion. The mobilization ended mass unemployment and transformed American industry, but it was not ordinary prosperity. It was a command economy created for destruction, followed by the difficult question of whether production could return to civilian life without another collapse. The institutions built for mobilization did not disappear when the weapons fell silent. Federal agencies had learned to direct materials, negotiate contracts, build factories, finance research, control prices, and coordinate production on a national scale. Large corporations had expanded through military contracts and government-funded plants. Universities, laboratories, and defense industries had developed relationships that would continue into the Cold War. The federal government had acquired new expectations of responsibility for employment, scientific development, and economic stability. The United States did not remain permanently organized, as it had been during the war. Price controls ended, soldiers demobilized, and factories converted. But the boundary between government, industry, finance, and military planning had permanently moved. The state that entered the war was not the state that emerged from it. Even before Germany surrendered, Allied officials were designing an international order intended to prevent the interwar catastrophe from returning. In July 1944, Delegates gathered at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire while armies were still fighting in Europe and the Pacific. Their subject was not military strategy, it was money. They remembered the unstable debts of the 1920s, the banking crises of the early 1930s, competitive currency devaluations, exchange restrictions, protectionism, and the fragmentation of trade into hostile blocs. The conference began from a simple recognition peace treaties could not create durable stability if the financial system rewarded panic and economic nationalism. The post-war world would require institutions capable of supporting currency stability, reconstruction, and international payments. Two men represented different positions within that shared objective. John Maynard Keynes arrived for Britain, a country fighting for survival while watching its financial independence erode. Harry Dexter White represented the United States Treasury, and a government whose bargaining power had grown with every shipment of food, fuel, and weapons. Keynes wanted a system that would give deficit countries room to recover and place pressure on persistent creditors as well as debtors. White's proposals gave greater weight to national contributions, fixed but adjustable exchange rates, and institutions in which American financial strength would carry substantial influence. Their dispute was technical, but the power behind it was unmistakable. Britain brought experience, argument, and imperial connections. The United States brought the money. The system that emerged created the International Monetary Fund and the institution that became the World Bank. Currencies would be tied to the dollar within adjustable limits while the dollar remained convertible into gold for foreign monetary authorities. The arrangement was meant to provide stability without reproducing the rigidities of the old gold standard. Countries could use capital controls and adjust exchange rates under certain conditions, rather than forcing every imbalance through unemployment and deflation. The institutions were not acts of pure generosity, nor were they merely instruments of American domination. They represented genuine learning from interwar failure designed through negotiations in which power was distributed unequally. Cooperation and hierarchy were built into the same architecture. For Britain, that hierarchy was painful. Sterling had once financed trade across the world, and London had stood at the center of international credit. The war accelerated a decline already visible before 1939. Britain had sold assets, accumulated obligations, and relied on American supplies to continue fighting. After the war, it faced reconstruction at home, commitments overseas, and claims on sterling held throughout the Empire and Commonwealth. Financial weakness did not automatically dismantle British imperial rule, but it narrowed the resources available to sustain it. Colonial resistance, nationalism, American pressure, changing political values, and the cost of military commitments all mattered. Yet the transfer of monetary power formed part of the same movement. An empire can survive military victory and still lose control over the financial system that once supported its reach. The strongest counter-argument to an economic interpretation is that battle's leaders' ideology, intelligence, and human sacrifice decided the war. That argument is correct as far as it goes. Soviet soldiers stopped and reversed the German invasion. British resistance denied Hitler an early settlement. American forces fought across oceans. Chinese resistance tied down Japanese armies. Command decisions, code-breaking weather training, and political leadership changed outcomes. Economic superiority did not operate automatically. Governments wasted resources, selected ineffective weapons, competed among themselves, and made catastrophic mistakes. Factories could produce options, not victories. But the reverse is also true. Strategy could not indefinitely overcome empty fuel tanks, destroyed shipping, missing trucks, exhausted pilots, and an enemy capable of replacing losses faster than they could be inflicted. The popular story of World War II therefore gets the villains' invasions and turning points largely right. Hitler's racial empire, Japan's imperial expansion, the invasion of Poland, Pearl Harbor, the Soviet struggle, the Battle of the Atlantic, and the Allied landings all belong at the center of the history. What the simplified version underplays is the system connecting them. Germany and Japan tried to answer insecurity through conquest, believing that territory could provide the resources their economies lacked. The Allies gradually answered aggression through a wider network of production, credit shipping, imperial supplies, central planning, taxation, and industrial coordination. One coalition sought self-sufficiency through domination. The other created greater strength by connecting economies whose interests were not identical, but whose combined resources could sustain a long war. Return then to the German tanks crossing into Poland in September 1939. The invasion began the European War, but it did not begin the forces that made the invasion possible. Behind the armored columns stood deferred debts-controlled trade, rationed foreign exchange state contracts, synthetic fuel plants, and a dictatorship that had tied economic recovery to rearmament and racial expansion. Behind Japan's attack in 1941 stood an empire trapped between its dependence on imported oil and its refusal to abandon conquest. Behind Allied victory stood not a single factory or financial policy, but an international system capable of turning money into ships into supply and supply into endurance. The Second World War was fought by soldiers. It was enabled by institutions. And its deepest economic consequence was that the power to finance the war became the power to design the peace. If this documentary changed how you understand the forces behind World War II, subscribe to the Price of History docs and like the video. And share your view in the comments. Was Axis defeat determined mainly by superior Allied resources, or by the way the Allies organized and delivered those resources?